Now, as I mentioned before, Bourdieu's concept of the habitus is a synthetic concept. And what that means is he's drawing from, as I mentioned, social theory, history, and as we'll see in a minute, psychology too. But in being a synthetic concept, he was oftentimes kind of developing, tweaking the concept, and kind of working out a definition. But let me give you my definition of what the habitus is. So in my definition, it's an internalized categorization system structured by the conditions and routines of the social world, which influences the perception and action of an individual, particularly on those things that seem the most, quote, natural and, quote, subjective. So it's a way for Bourdieu to understand that classic Durkheimian idea of somehow we are the product of the social world. And what the social world is how we think and how we interact with the world. So this is Bourdieu's way of solving the puzzle. And one of the ways he does it is being a scholar in the late, or I should say in the mid to late 20th century, he's familiar with revolutions in the field of psychology. And I think we have some students in the class who are from psychology department, so you may have to email me and correct me on some of this. I'm going to paint with a broad brush. But one of the things that Bourdieu reached to was Piaget's psychology. You may be familiar with that name. He was part of the great kind of wars of psychologists in the mid-20th century of how to understand humans. And of course, there was a dominant school of behavioralism, which was the idea that we're like a rat in a cage, and if you ding a bell enough and give cheese, the rat figures out that the bell precedes cheese. And so a number of psychologists thought, well, hey, that must be how humans are, just this kind of reflex action thing. And Piaget, and of course Bourdieu, eventually says, no, it's actually a lot more complicated than that. And a key point of Piaget's psychological vision was that our knowledge of the world, so as individuals, as we walk around living our lives and doing what we do, is not theoretical. So our knowledge of the social world, it's not like you and I each have kind of like a USB drive that's been plugged into a USB port in our head, and that USB could kind of be walked around to anyone, and it's got some kind of formulas and codes on it, and you can poke it into anybody's head, and they'll live exactly the same way. So instead of knowledge being kind of theoretical and separable from who we are and our interactions in our life, instead Piaget sees that our practical knowledge, and this is important, practical knowledge of the social world is developed through interaction and actually doing things. So this is, of course, a great debate in education. Should students just learn theory, or should students do things? And so Piaget is kind of trying to walk a middle ground, but landing that on the reality that so much of who we are and what we know is through interaction with the world and how we actually live. And knowledge then is not out there. So as we learn, think about as we learn as children, we're not given a manual about, okay, here's the manual or here's the data drive for how to behave with your brother or sister, or how to act with a group of people, or which dishes you use at dinner time. There's no manual that writes it out in some logical order. But instead, we develop our knowledge of how to be a good brother and sister, or which dishes to use by doing it, by watching others around us do these things, by interacting with these processes, by sometimes getting out of line and being punished by our parents. Well, a good brother doesn't do that. Or maybe dropping a dish and being told, you know what, those are our good dishes, be careful with those. So we learn all the knowledge that we need to live, we learn through practical action. And an important part of this is that of Piaget and of Bourdieu is that knowledge, or the world, is not separated between kind of a brain, a knower, we as humans, an object world out there, separate from us. Instead, both Piaget and Bourdieu want to bring those worlds together so that we literally come to know and come to interact with, and come to be a part of the social world through interaction. It's not like we're separate and we decide to enter it, or we can look at it out there, but instead there's a merging of these aspects of our lives in the world. And beyond Piaget, intriguingly, there's some very new neuroscience psychological work, which is in some way, according to some sociologists, buttressing the original comments of Bourdieu and showing that Bourdieu seems to have been onto something. And let me mention a couple of those. And some of the most cutting edge neuroscience and psychology today, the brain, so our brain is no longer seen as kind of this organ that's distinct and separate from the body. Instead, the brain is seen as part of the body, always continuously aware of the body, and able to interact with the world by continuously mapping the states of the body. And in turn, the body, so my finger or my eye, my sense organs, my smell, my mouth, are not just kind of a relay station that's, salty, beep, beep, hey brain, salty. But instead, the way we sense the world, there's actually a whole process as the signals travel to our brain. Those signals aren't just carrying raw information, but they're actually carrying the implications of what we're sensing. They're carrying some kind of pre-conscious meanings of what we're actually sensing in the world through our sense organs. So you can see that there's this breakdown in psychology from these distinct separations of the world and us, or of knowing and feeling. But there's more of a unity between these things, and this is all important for Bourdieu's theory. And one of the most, I think, kind of cool discoveries in recent neuroscience is these things called mirror neurons, and they're kind of literally what they suggest, which is there's a certain group of neurons which research shows their job is to basically mirror what we see in the social world. And it seems like these are particularly important for things like compassion. You can think, for example, if you come upon a crying person and all of a sudden you kind of hunch, your face kind of takes this look of caring and concern, and you have this sense of empathy, like, oh, that must have really hurt how you just scraped your knee. So you even show on your face and in your body that you can, quote unquote, feel their pain. Well, the cognitive science is showing that there are these neurons that actually can mirror those aspects of the social world pre-consciously. So we don't decide to mirror it, but we're able to mirror it in kind of this kind of stunning way that we don't have to think about it. All of this psychology, the early psychology, informed Bourdieu, and some of this later psychology seems to show that Bourdieu was onto something. And let me tell you in a direct way what I mean by that. One of the ways that Bourdieu talked about this idea of the habitus is he referred to it as our embodied history. So the habitus that you and I have are the embodied history of what we have grown up with from the very beginning moments of our lives. What he meant by this was that the way we see the social world and interact with the social world has to do with the whole chain of reactions and interactions we've had with the social world ever since we were a young person, and that these interactions with the social world create what he calls bodily schemas. So these are very similar to what I've just talked about from the psychological research, where they create in us these pre-conscious or unconscious ways of seeing the world and then behaving in the world. A great example, a real quick example of what embodied history means is, if you can think for a moment, at some point early in your life, you may have learned to play a sport or a hobby. And if we were to zoom back in time, those early moments of learning to play a sport or do a hobby were full of all sorts of mistakes that you kept making over and over and over again. That all now is all gone. And now, when you sit down to play the piano or ride a bike or play basketball or maybe sing in a choir, you have a sense of that it just comes to you, that it's natural or that it's second nature. But a sociologist operating with this insight would say, no, 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 what I'm seeing now, the skill that you're showing now is actually the embodied history of all the mistakes and practice and interactions that you had early on that have now kind of been forgotten, but whose result, the proficiency of your ability to do these various hobbies and sports, is actually now a part of your body. And in this neuroscience way, the body is not just, as I've said, this reception for signals, but actually connects to the brain in a much deeper way than we could have ever known. And so Bourdieu has this wonderful, wonderful phrase for what habitus means for people, which is we have literally, our habitus develops a feel for the game. And what he means by that is that whatever basically kind of environment, and I'll say more about this in a minute, that we're shaped from or have all these interactions in, and I use these sports or hobbies as an example, but Bourdieu means our whole life as an example. We are shaped for the game, for the field, if you will, from last week, that we're born into. And so we develop a, quote, feel for the game, so that things feel natural, and that we have, through these early interactions and routines of our social world, we have the ability to perform well at the particular game we're born into. Game in a metaphoric sense there, being the particular social world that we're born into. Let me pause there, I'll come right back, and we're going to talk more about how Bourdieu thought our habitus was shaped. Or as I began the lecture, remember that I said that Bourdieu said that the habitus was structured, so influenced by the social world. I'm going to come back and tell you more about what Bourdieu had to say about that in just a moment.